I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but the day of reckoning is here. I think if you've been paying attention to news about the AAA gaming space recently, it's pretty easy to see where things are going. It's basically every day that you hear about a live service game getting shut down, massive studio layoffs, or a studio just shutting down entirely. And a lot of this is coming down to AAA budgets being way overblown. Because as gaming hardware gets more powerful, then the demand for these games that take full advantage of the hardware gets greater and greater. More graphical fidelity, high-res textures, photorealistic graphics. And the same thing content-wise. You gotta have skill trees, you gotta have a leveling up system, you gotta have endgame content, you gotta have a DLC plan. You gotta have every character fully voiced and motion captured. You gotta have a big, giant story. You gotta have all these extra side quests. And I think maybe a lot of these games start off a bit smaller in scope. Cyberpunk 2077 is probably a great example, but then they just get overblown, and all of a sudden, what might be a $20 or $30 million game becomes a $100 million game. Think of it like you're loading things onto a boat, and you're going, oh, we gotta have this, gotta have this, gotta have this. Eventually, you're gonna overload yourself, and that ship is gonna sink. And that's exactly what's happening with a lot of developers right now, and a lot of publishers. So not a lot of game development budgets are publicly available, but I'm going to go through a few that we do have just to illustrate this point. Cyberpunk 2077, $174 million. Last of Us Part 2, $220 million. Horizon Forbidden West, $212 million. Callisto Protocol, $160 million. And some of these games have sold well, some not so much, some have only sold well after massive discounts. And when you have a game that is just this giant that takes up so many resources, if that one game flops, it can tank an entire company. Because it's not that long ago that in the PS2 and GameCube era, and even in the 360 and PS3 era, game development was generally 2 to 3 years. But now we're seeing a minimum of 5-year development per AAA title. And if you spend at least 5 years, but more realistically 6 or 7 or 8, developing one game and it flops, the company cannot survive that. At that point, you've got the better part of a decade working on one thing that is not successful. You can't get that time back. You can't get that money back. And that's why we're seeing a lot of layoffs at studios recently. Places like Crystal Dynamics and Hi-Res Studios and Gearbox have all seen layoffs. There were layoffs at Blackbird, who developed Minecraft Legends. There were layoffs at Daedalic Entertainment, who developed that Lord of the Rings Gollum game, which, yeah, that was kind of a joke for a while. Oh, look how bad this game is. But when a game is that bad and it doesn't sell well, that has real-world consequences. Ascendant Studios, who developed Immortals of Avium that just recently released and was hyped up as this Unreal Engine 5 thing, didn't sell very well at all, and they've laid off 45% of their staff, almost half their people gone. That's basically catastrophe for a game studio. CD Projekt Red laid off about 100 people, and of course there was the recent news about Volition, the developers of Saints Row, just being entirely shut down by the Embracer Group. And that recent Saints Row reboot apparently cost over $100 million to make. Obviously it did not sell very well, and that lack of sales has an impact on the studio. The studio is gone now. And it really sucks for a lot of the developers that are working at these studios, because a lot of times they're not the ones making the decisions that end up negatively affecting the game. They're just doing what they're told. The boss says, make a skill tree system, they make a skill tree system. The boss says, create art for this area of the game, they create art for the area of the game. They're just doing their jobs. But they're the ones that are going to be negatively affected by these layoffs, which really sucks. Because for a lot of developers, on top of crunch, on top of workplace scandals like you have at Activision, they're now having to deal with this. And I feel for them. Because if you're a developer at a AAA studio where the game is becoming a bit unwieldy, maybe not looking like it's as good as it could be, you're probably sweating bullets right now thinking, is this gonna flop? Am I gonna have a job after this game ships? Because all you can do is hope the game either becomes viral somehow or your studio gets bought by Microsoft. And sadly, I don't think stories about layoffs like these are going to let up anytime soon. I think you're gonna see a lot more headlines about various studios either cutting staff or shutting down over the next few years. because these massive budgets, a lot of that is going towards payroll, and that's going to be one of the first things they cut. You're probably going to see some new CEOs come in who basically act as hatchet men and go through and just cut out departments entirely or just slim them down where they can. But the thing is, as terrible as this is for the people affected, it kind of has to happen because these budgets are not at all sustainable. Yes, gaming is more popular than it's ever been, but there's still only so many copies that you can sell of a game like God of War Ragnarok, which I believe sold pretty well, but it's still not like Call of Duty or something, selling tens of millions of copies every year. Because a lot of these games with giant budgets, like I mentioned, they're still very core games. They're not really something that's going to appeal to a casual so much who's just starting to get their foot into video games. They're going to gravitate towards something like Call of Duty or Madden or Fortnite. So what's going to happen now with AAA games? Well, first of all, there will still be AAA games. They're just going to be more few and far between. And I think you're going to see less companies taking a risk on new IPs and instead diverting things toward long-standing titles. Like you're going to see companies not put money into something new like Forspoken. Square Enix is instead just going to funnel that money into the next Final Fantasy game. I think we will see a resurgence of the AA market for games. Games that are not AAA but not indie, somewhere in the middle. It kind of feels like AA games haven't been a thing in a very long time, like since the PS2 era. So that is a change I would welcome, and it makes sense for companies. If you spend less money on something, it's a lot easier to get your money back. I think we're also going to be seeing a lot bigger focus on remakes and remasters, which is also not necessarily a bad thing. Because there are a lot of games that are stuck on older hardware, not super easy to get a hold of these days, that are very high quality and could use a second chance. Like the Thousand Year Door remake, which Nintendo just announced. That's great that that's coming to a platform that people actually have these days. So you're going to be seeing a lot of companies thumbing through their back catalog and thinking, okay, what can we bring up? What can we remake? What can we port and upscale a bit to make it look a bit better? Because more availability for these older games is a good thing, and a lot of them could potentially sell as well as a new game, despite being a fraction of the budget. However, do not be surprised when these things cost full price, $60 or maybe even $70. Because the price of a video game is not determined by the budget of it, it's just determined by what the publisher thinks they can sell it at. I think you're also going to see more deals struck with what you could call premium indie games. Indie games that have a bit of a stronger profile, something like Hades 2 or Sea of Stars or Hollow Knight Silksong. Games that, especially compared to AAA titles, have very small budgets, but still can sell well and appeal to a large number of people. So I think you're going to see a lot of publishers making deals with indie studios to publish their games, which for the indie studios is a great opportunity. And I think you're also going to be seeing platform holders like PlayStation or Xbox or Nintendo make exclusivity deals with some indie companies, which is also, for the indie companies, really great. Because a lot of the cool innovation in games, a lot of the most creative ideas you see over the last few years are not coming out of the AAA space, they're coming out of indie games. And I think you're also going to be seeing more games with a heavy emphasis on procedural generation. Which, aside from Minecraft, I can't really think of another game that uses procedural generation heavily and really makes it feel organic. And the first game studio that can do that, or maybe the first engine that can do that can really make procedural generation feel like it's handcrafted by a person, they are going to be super successful. Like if they can create some sort of procedural generation technology that can really nail it, I think you're going to be seeing a lot of licensing deals then with other game companies to use that software. And sort of in the same vein, I know a lot of people really don't like to hear it, but I think you're also going to be seeing a lot more AI being used to develop games. Not that ChatGPT is going to write the whole story for a game or some image generation thing is just going to create the entire world, but I think you are going to see, instead of maybe 10 artists working to create textures for an area, you're going to see one artist using an AI to create textures for that area. And I know that's not something that people really want to be reality, but it's coming, and at this point, it's pretty much unstoppable. And the way I see it is you can either ride the wave or you can get swept under the current. And I know if I was an artist working in games, I'd be learning as much as I possibly could about AI in order to use it best myself and increase my job security. And I don't think it really gets talked about enough, but there's also a lot of things that AI could do for games that is just not possible with current technology. Like, think about an NPC that uses something like ChatGPT to react to what you do in the game dynamically in a way that would just require so much work to do, and obviously so much more money to do today with someone just manually writing out every single possibility. So gaming itself is not going to entirely go away, but you are going to see less games with as big a budget as games currently have coming out. And sometimes events like these layoffs, like these studios shutting down, are what an industry needs in order to eventually stabilize. Because we don't need another gaming crash of 1983, and I don't think that's what's going to happen, but if budgets don't get under control somewhat, it's possible. And I do think that a lot of the developers who have been laid off in recent weeks will land on their feet and hopefully end up somewhere at a place that knows how to manage their budgets properly. Alright, that is the end of the video. Thank you for watching.